Hello everyone, I'm Jody Holthouse from the Meadowlark Extension District. I'm the district livestock agent. That's for the counties of Jackson, Jefferson, and Nemaha County in eastern Kansas. Welcome to our Tailgate Talk series. We weren't planning to do this virtually, but we're trying to adjust. Usually it's 3 sessions scattered throughout the summer, out on location. And we're hopeful that maybe by the 3rd session we will be able to meet you in person. But we're adjusting, and this is how we're going to be doing it. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Jackson and Nemaha County Conservation Districts and the NRCS, and they will be providing some of our speakers that you'll meet later on. We did have hosts lined up, producers that were going to host us in their pastures, and we're hopeful that you will get to meet them maybe the 3rd session. So we're always talking about yields when it comes to our commodity crops, how many bushels an acre we get, but you don't ever hear many people talking about their yield of their pasture, and I think we need to start measuring it. You can't manage what you don't measure. We are grass farmers instead of row crop farmers with the big combines that are yellow or red. Our combines weigh about 1,200 pounds. They have 4 legs and a 4-inch header. So we are grass farmers. We are trying to produce as much grass as we can for those animals. And if you're using the same stocking rate that your father or your grandfather used, your pastures might start showing some wear. The national average weight of a cow is now 1,350 to 1,400 pounds. And a lot of those old stocking rate guidelines were 1,000-pound cow. And somebody said the other day the only 1,000-pound cows you see are the mini Herefords or maybe a longhorn heifer once in a while. So we need to adjust our stocking rates for sure. So in this session we're going to talk about measuring our grasses, plant growth and development, and how you need to manage that throughout the season. One of those tools that we will be using is a grazing stick. And right now I'm going to turn this over to my coworker, David Hallauer. He does the crops and soils for our district, Meadowlark District. He's going to talk to you about plant growth and development.
Thank you, Jody. One of the things that we sometimes take for granted a little bit as a grass manager might be the fact that that plant that's growing out there, that grass plant that we're using to run through our animals, has a life cycle. It has a process that it has to go to survive on a year in, year out basis. And so I want to talk just a little bit about a brief understanding of how that plant may respond to how we're grazing it out there so that down the road we can help to manage our grazing system a little bit better. First, I want to split it into 2 different types of plants. We know that there's both annual and perennial type forages. Perennial type forages are the brome, fescues, native grasses, Indian grass, big and little blue stem that we have planted out there that we want to continue to graze on a year in and year out basis. Our annual forages are those that we might plant on a year in and year out basis. Some are annual forages, for instance, wheat, any of those type of crops that are going to essentially be done in one growing season. Now, they both tend to grow to somewhat the same type of way, but they are managed differently. And so we are much more concerned in most cases about how we manage a perennial grass clear through the end of the season than we are an annual grass. We have to understand that we can't manage those 2 forages exactly the same way. We can maximize things differently with one type of forage, maybe an annual type of forage grazing through the season, than we can a perennial forage that we need to allow to have some rest at the end of the growing season. We also have essentially 2 different growing seasons for plants, if you will. We have what's known as C3 and C4 plants. C3 plants are our cool season plants. They're the predominance of the species that we have here in northeast Kansas. Brome grass is one of our favorites. We also have plenty of fescue out there. We've even got some bluegrass. There's probably even some other species in this hayfield behind me that would fit into that area as well. They are species that grow well when temperatures are in the 40 to mid 70 degree range. They really like our cool season climate. They like early spring. They like late in the fall. An understanding of that helps us to know that at some point that plant is going to have to be managed differently from a grazing or haying standpoint so that it can recover, so that it has a chance to rest. On the flip side are the C4 plants. Those are our native warm season grass plants that we often see in some of our warm season pastures that consist of Indian grass, big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, and some of those types of plants. Again, they're C4 plants. They like temperatures in the 70 on up through the mid-90s. They do very, very well in the Flint Hills area of the state where we're grazing animals all year round. They respond very well to those warm summer temperatures, and they too require a time period of rest and appropriate grazing management, but it's a different time frame than what it might be for cool season plants. Now, what we're trying to do, whether we have C3 plants, C4 plants, or whether we're even grazing legumes, other broadleaves, we're trying to manage that plant to maximize photosynthetic capacity. We want leaves to grow on a plant so that we can capture energy from sunlight, so that we can take that energy that we capture from sunlight, that we can run it through the photosynthetic process, and we can put that down into energy that goes into roots so that we can replenish that plant, and also that continues to go into leaves that continue to grow that plant. Within that plant, that energy is converted to protein, fiber, and all types of different things as that plant goes through the early stages of growth on up through maturity. Unused energy in those processes accumulates and is stored in those roots. What we are trying to do at all times is we're trying to make sure that we are maximizing what we can capture from a photosynthetic capacity so that we can make sure that we're getting adequate root growth and also adequate top growth so that we can continue to balance those two things. They help feed each other. In many cases, we're trying to rest plants at the end of the season so that we can make sure that photosynthesis is maximized from those leaves and roots are replenished so that we can kick off the process in that perennial forage again the next spring. As we talk about the phases that a plant goes through as it's maximizing photosynthesis or as roots are being grown, we talk about it usually into 3 different stages: a vegetative stage, an elongation phase, and then a reproductive phase.
Let's talk a little bit more about those different growth stages. Vegetative growth is obviously when that plant is very young. Chlorophyll development is rapid. May not be meeting the plant needs though. In fact, we often don't see the chlorophyll production from the leaves that plant has produced fully meeting the needs of that plant and being able to replenish things in the root crown until about 2 to 3 leaves are formed. So up until that point, we're actually pulling from root reserves along the way. And that can be an issue if we're grazing too soon or some other things happen along the way. But for the most part, just remember that 2 to 3 leaves are needed until that plant is able to fully support itself on its own. Remember as well that leaves do have a definite lifespan. They are going to, at some point, start to senesce, and we'll talk about that just a little bit more as we get into the later stages of growth. Now, vegetative growth obviously happens from low down in the canopy. We see growth points that are in the crown of that plant. We see tillers that are coming out the edge of that grass plant. You can see in this graphic here the growth points of that plant coming from those tillers. Those are the places where that leaf is going to start to expand from. If you are to mow a grass plant, for example, it doesn't grow a new tip. It starts to grow from the base of those leaves, and it starts to elongate from that point right there. And so that's where you get new leaves that come from, particularly during the vegetative growth stage. Now, we also have lots of shoots, buds, those sorts of things that are below ground that as we graze that plant or as we cut that plant, it will initiate growth from those as well, and they'll start to come from down around that soil line. Elongation is the next stage. That's where the growth point starts to move up through the ground a little bit. If we only have removal of leaf tips at that point, then growth continues and it's really not that big a deal. But if we remove the whole plant, then all of a sudden the plant may have to start regrowing from underground root mass, and at that point we may have stressed that plant to some degree if we've not given it adequate opportunity for those root reserves to be replenished. Reproduction is obviously when that plant gets to seed head production. That is when the plant has sent itself a signal that I need to go into reproductive mode to survive. And at that point, the growth point of that plant has moved up through the plant. It is very easy at that point to remove that growth point, but it's also good that the plant at that particular point sends signals to the base of that plant saying that we need to form new tillers. We need to go ahead and start regrowth from there. So chlorophyll production does continue. Roots continue to be fed. Leaves do continue to grow, but at reproduction, things slow down quite a bit, and that growth point is more easily removed. Now, why is all of that important? Think of your plant like this. So you've got an above ground part that grows leaves. It's the part that collects sunlight energy. It's the part that feeds the plant leaves. It's the part that, by feeding plant leaves, helps also to feed plant roots. It is the part that is trying to balance how do we continue to support ourselves. Then you have the below ground part. That part is the roots that helps kick off the plant as it starts to grow. And then anytime along the way when we remove too much of that top growth, then plant roots again have to come into play, and they have to get the process kick-started again. So it's important that we understand that growth and develop so that we can maximize what we're doing. Basically, we're trying to maximize root growth and maximize top growth, and we do that by keeping them in some sort of balance. Root growth often does equal top growth. We often see those things kind of equivalent to each other, and so we want to make sure that we're managing so that we are not depleting either of them too much so that the other is not stressed. That is important because root growth is a huge factor when it comes to how much top growth removed. So this chart here shows what happens when we remove too much leaf growth. And you can see why we use the take half, leave half rule. If we remove 50% of the leaf growth, then really we don't stop root growth all that much. Nothing is compromised very much. Think of it as that root mass shrinking as we graze. If we graze to the 50% point, we're really not removing very much root mass at that point. But look what happens when we increase to 60, 70, 80. At 80%, we're actually stopping root growth for almost 2 weeks. If we really graze that plant hard, then we may stop that for as much as 2.5 to 3 weeks. And that can be significant, especially if that occurs during drought periods, especially if we continue to leave animals on there, especially if the stand for some reason has been compromised or fertility is not good. And so we want to make sure at all times that we are leaving appropriate top growth so that we can maximize that root growth. An understanding is also important as to how we are growing or when that plant is growing well. This picture here is of a forage production distribution chart from our Kansas Grazing Lands Management Handbook. It shows where growth occurs. And so we can use charts like this to help us understand when the best time to grow is, as well as being out there and understanding how that plant is growing.
My name is Keith Johnson. I'm the Purdue University Forage Extension Specialist located in the state of Indiana. And like many disciplines, there are tools that one can use to help you make decisions, and one of those in the pasture industry is that of the grazing stick, of which I am holding here. And we're going to go through how to utilize such a tool for the purpose of estimating the yield of forage dry matter that might be out in a pasture field. Upon casual observation, this looks very simply to be a yardstick, but as one evaluates and looks at the different sides of this, you see a lot of different information that is provided on the grazing stick. And so the purpose of today is to kind of help one begin the understanding of how the stick works, and to take you to a location where the actual written down how to use the stick is given. One of the first things that we do need to do is to identify the particular forage, because the amount of dry matter per acre inch is going to be different for tall fescue as compared to alfalfa, for instance. So I'm here today in a pretty much pure tall fescue field, and so we've identified the forage. The next step is to get an idea of how tall the height of the forage actually is in the field. And so of course we would put this in vertical position, take it down to the ground level, and would measure the height of the forage. And there is one caution that I would give, is one would not take the tallest leaf blade and hold it up and say that this stand is 15 inches tall, but rather you would go down to about a height where there is more consistent growth occurring. And so today, if I were looking at this, I would say that there's about 9 inches from the soil surface to where most of the vegetation is going to be found to be about a 9-inch zone. Now, as one looks at this grazing stick, we really don't have 9 inches of grazable forage. We're going to have a lesser amount than that, because in a rotational pasture we would like to stop grazing when we're at about 4 inches. So on this stick there's a little rectangle here, and that's a zone of stopping grazing, and for the purposes of today we'll say that we're going to stop grazing when the average height that the crop has been removed to by grazing is 4 inches. So in the example we started out with 9 inches, We're going to leave 4. So we had 5 inches of grazable forage. Now on this grazing stick, we have a spot that's called forage. Okay, and as we flip the stick, we see that we have many, many different types of forages that are listed there under that column. And the other thing that we need to do as we evaluate what the forage actually is how much of the soil is covered by the forage that's out in the pasture. So in this example, we have less than 75% cover, 75 to 90% cover, or greater than 90% cover. Where we're at today, I would probably estimate that we're probably somewhat less than 90% cover. There is a little bit of soil that is showing. If we look into the stand here from above, you can see that there is some soil, and probably we're somewhere around 85% cover. So we're about 85% of the sunlight's being harvested by the plant through photosynthesis. So if we find the tall fescue line, take us over to that column that was 75 to 90% cover. It's telling us that we have somewhere between 250 and 350 pounds of dry matter per acre inch. Now recall that we had grazable forage of 5 inches. So an estimate of yield in this particular area that received no nitrogen fertilizer at all, we have approximately 300 pounds per acre inch times 5 inches of grazable forage, or 1,500 pounds of dry matter per acre. So that's an estimate of the yield. The other thing that's pretty powerful about this particular stick is that down on one of these sides we have a couple of algebraic equations. And as one works through training their eye in terms of how many animals might be on a particular paddock or the number of days of grazing, we can put the characteristics of your pasture and the livestock being fed on that pasture, and we can calculate the animal number or the number of days of grazing that might be out there in that particular pasture. So such things as the total dry matter per acre, of which we just calculated, the size of the acreage of the paddock that they're grazing, the harvest efficiency, and that is a number, again, going back to this stick that has lots of information on it. We find the header harvest efficiency. And so, again, we rotate the stick, and with continuous grazing, we're only 25% efficient. A 6-paddock system is estimated to be 45% efficient. And as we increase paddock number, the percent efficiency increases. So that's one of the good advantages of splitting your continuously grazed pasture into many paddocks, is we're getting a greater amount of harvest efficiency. So that's a number that we have to put into this equation as well. So that's the numerator. The denominator is what is the weight of the animals out on the pasture. In other words, if we had 20 cows that weighed 1,200 pounds each, that would be 24,000 pounds of animal weight, times the intake rate in percent body weight. And I would guesstimate on this type of forage composition, we might be getting an intake of 2.5% of the body weight per day. And then the number of days of grazing that we might expect from this, and that will calculate the number of animals that we can run on a particular pasture. Or we can manipulate that equation and we can find the number of days of grazing, and again with the same information, the productivity, the number of acres, the harvest efficiency, the animal weight and the animal number, and the intake rate and percent body weight. We can figure out whether there might be 3 days of grazing or whether we might have 20 days of grazing. So going through this helps train ourselves such that as working through a season or two with the use of this grazing stick, we've trained her eye. And frankly, after that point, we might not any longer take this grazing stick to a pasture. It strictly may become a yardstick. But it is a very useful tool for those that are beginning to get into rotational grazing, and even for individuals that have been experienced livestock producers that are learning the advantages of rotational grazing. It's a device that can be used to train your eye in an effective manner.
There are some differences between the stick he is using and the Kansas grazing stick, so we will go over those now. The first is, I'd like to thank the sponsors, the Kansas Association of Conservation Districts, the Kansas Grassland Forage Council, K-State Research and Extension, and the NRCS. This was also funded by a grant from the West Star Energy Green Team. So the first part of the stick is just the major ruler that we use to measure the grass. And then we have a lot of different goals on here. Grazing goal is to utilize a stocking rate that balances the livestock demand with the forage production. There's a lot of charts on here that have been scientifically studied. For instance, the forage height, grazing recommendations, what height the forage should be at before you begin to graze, and then the absolute minimum it should be. There's also the estimated dry matter in pounds per inch per acre, and you base this on whether it's a low, medium, or high density stand. And there's several different types of forages listed. Even the native tallgrass prairie is on there. Forage intake, percent of body weight. For a dry cow, we say 2 to 3%, lactating cow 3 to 4%, for horse, stocker cattle, or sheep and goats, so it's all on there. Then there's a section that is definitions that will help later in some of the mathematical formulas that we do. There's a stocking rate calculation, and there's 4 steps on how to get that created. The stocking rate calculation for season long, as well as if you're rotating. We also have the optimum grazing period. For cow-calf, it's 3 to 5 days. For a stocker, it's 1 to 2 days. There's also a chart on grazing efficiency and harvest efficiency based on the number of paddocks you have. And then there's the formulas for figuring out how many grazing days you might have in a certain paddock. There's also a formula for how many livestock to put on your pasture or your stocking rate. There's a chart for the water requirements for livestock and recommended rest periods. So there's just a lot of information on this one stick. We are hopeful that at the end of the summer we may get to meet you in person, hand you your grazing stick, and help you learn how to use it. Thank you.